Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. Can you legally set a trap for someone on your own property? My neighbor told me I was overreacting about his kids ruining my crops. He had no idea how far I would go to protect my land, all while staying perfectly within the law. The sound of their engines sputtering out was music to my ears. I've been farming the same piece of land for close to 2 decades now. It's not a massive operation. Just under 200 acres that's been in my family since my grandfather bought it back in the 1950s. I grow mostly soybeans and corn, with some hay and a few acres of vegetables that I sell at the local farmer's market. It's honest work, and I've always taken pride in being a good steward of the land. About 8 years ago, a new family moved into the property adjacent to mine. The father worked some kind of sales job that had him traveling constantly, and the mother was a teacher at the elementary school in town. They had 3 boys aged roughly 10, 12, and 14 when they first arrived. Within a month of moving in, those kids had ATVs. Nice ones, too, the kind that cost several $1,000s each. At first, I didn't mind hearing them riding around on their own property. Kids need outdoor activities, and I'd rather hear the sound of ATVs than have them glued to screens all day. Their land was mostly wooded with some open areas, plenty of space for them to ride around without bothering anyone. The problem started that first spring after they moved in. I was out checking my fields one morning and noticed fresh ATV tracks cutting right through the edge of my soybean field. The plants were still young and the tracks had destroyed maybe 20 feet of the row. It wasn't a huge amount of damage, but it bothered me. I figured it was probably an accident. Maybe the kids had gotten turned around and didn't realize they'd crossed onto my property. I walked over to the neighbor's house that evening and spoke with the father. I kept it friendly, just mentioned that I'd seen some ATV tracks in my field and wanted to make sure the kids knew where the property line was. He apologized, said he'd talk to them, and I left thinking that would be the end of it. A week later, more tracks. This time they'd torn up a section near the road where I had my early tomatoes planted. I'd already invested time and money in those plants, and now a good portion of them were ruined. I went back to talk to the neighbor again. This time the conversation was a bit less friendly on his end. He said boys would be boys, that it was probably an honest mistake, and that I was making too big a deal out of it. When I mentioned that this was the second time and asked if he could maybe keep the boys on their own property, he got defensive, said his kids had a right to ride their ATVs, that we lived in the country, and that these things happened. I pointed out that they didn't have a right to ride them through my crops, and the conversation ended without any real resolution. Over the next few months, it became a pattern. The boys discovered that if they hit my fields right after a good rain, they could really get the ATVs moving, tearing up the soft ground and creating these massive ruts. I'd find new damage every week or two. I tried putting up signs. I tried talking to the mother, who seemed sympathetic but said she couldn't control what the boys did when she was at work. I even called the non-emergency police line once. The deputy who came out was sympathetic but not particularly helpful. He went over and talked to the family, but he basically told me that unless I caught them in the act and wanted to press charges, there wasn't much he could do. He suggested I document everything and consider getting cameras or posting more visible signage. I took his advice. I bought a trail camera and mounted it where I'd been seeing the most activity. Sure enough, I caught the boys on video multiple times over the next month, clear as day, tearing through my fields. I collected this evidence carefully, dating everything, taking photos of the damage, keeping receipts for the plants and seed I'd lost. 3 years back, things came to a head. I lost an entire section of soybeans because the damage was so severe that the plants in that area just couldn't recover. I had the ATV footage, I had documentation of the damage, and I had receipts. I estimated my losses at around $3,500 for that section alone, not counting all the previous damage over the years. I gathered everything together and went to talk to the neighbor one final time. I brought printouts of the trail camera footage, my damage documentation, everything. I told him I needed to be compensated for my losses and that the trespassing had to stop immediately. He looked through what I'd brought and I could see his jaw tightening. Finally, he looked up at me and said the kids were just riding around, that I was trying to ruin his family over some dirt and plants. I tried to explain that this was my livelihood, that I'd asked repeatedly for this to stop, and that I'd been more than patient. He basically told me it was my problem to deal with, that if I cared so much I should build a fence or something. That's when I decided to take a different approach. I spent a few days just thinking about the situation. Putting up a fence around 200 acres would cost a fortune, easily $50,000 or more for anything that would actually stop an ATV. I couldn't afford that, and I shouldn't have to. I tried the legal route with the police, and that hadn't worked. I tried being neighborly, and that had gotten me nowhere. Then I started looking more carefully at where exactly the ATV damage was occurring. The boys had a few favorite routes through my property, and there was one section they used more than any other. It was about a 2-acre area that connected their wooded property to a service road on the far side of my land. They'd basically turned it into their personal highway. I pulled out my property survey maps, the ones I'd gotten when I inherited the farm. I studied them carefully, comparing them to the current aerial photos I could access online. And that's when I noticed something interesting. That 2-acre section the boys loved so much. According to my survey, it was about 15 feet over on my side of the property line. Not by much, but enough. The property line wasn't a straight shot. It had this odd jog in it, probably from how the land had been divided up generations ago. The neighbor's property line cut in, then back out, and that little section where the boys were riding was definitely mine. I got an official surveyor to come out and confirm it. Cost me $800, but it was worth it. He placed markers showing the actual property line, and sure enough, the boys' favorite riding path was entirely on my land. Now I had an idea. I did some research into agricultural water management. In my county, there are conservation programs that actually encourage farmers to create water retention areas. These are basically designed to catch runoff, prevent erosion, and recharge groundwater. They're considered environmentally beneficial, and the county conservation office actually helps farmers plan and implement them. I made an appointment with the conservation office and spoke to one of their agricultural specialists. I explained that I had a section of land that tended to have drainage issues. Not entirely untrue, the ground there did get pretty saturated after heavy rains, partly because of all the ATV damage that had destroyed the natural vegetation. I asked about creating a water retention area in that specific 2-acre section. The specialist came out, looked at the site, and agreed it would be a good location for such a feature. The ground was relatively low compared to the surrounding area, and it would naturally collect water. He helped me fill out the paperwork for the conservation program. I applied for the necessary permits through the county conservation program. The whole process took about 6 weeks, but eventually everything was approved. I had official documentation stating that I was creating an agricultural water retention area for environmental and erosion control purposes. Once the permits were in hand, I hired a local excavation company to do the work. I was very specific about what I wanted. The retention area needed to be in that exact 2-acre section, and it needed to be dug out to create a basin that would hold water. Over the course of 3 days, they dug out that 2-acre section, creating a basin that was about 4 feet deep in the center with gently sloping sides. The excavated soil was used to build up a berm on the downhill side to help contain the water. When they were finished, I had a perfectly legal, properly permitted agricultural feature on my property. Then I waited. It was early October and we were entering the rainy season. Within a week, we got a good storm that dropped about 3 inches of rain. By Monday morning, my new retention area was holding about 8 inches of standing water mixed with the disturbed soil, creating a soupy mud pit that covered those 2 acres. It took less than a week. I was out checking my corn one morning when I heard the familiar sound of ATVs in the distance. Then I heard the engines rev up as they approached the area where they usually cut through. Then the sound changed. Engines revving high but not moving, then sputtering. I walked over to see what was happening, though I already knew. All 3 boys were stuck in the retention area, and I mean stuck. Their ATVs had sunk up to the axles in the muddy soup. The more they tried to throttle out, the deeper they sank. By the time I got there, one of the machines was buried almost to the seat. The boys saw me approaching and started yelling for help. I stood at the edge of the retention area, on my property, and asked them what they were doing there. The oldest one, who must have been about 17 by then, started to say something about how they always rode through here, but he trailed off when he realized how that sounded. The youngest looked like he might cry. I told them they were trespassing on my property and that they needed to get themselves and their machines out of there. Then I walked back to my truck and called their father. The conversation was brief. I told him his boys were stuck on my property and he needed to come get them. He started to argue, but I cut him off and said if he didn't come get them in the next hour, I'd be calling the sheriff to report the trespassing. He hung up on me. He showed up about 40 minutes later in his truck looking furious. He saw his boys standing at the edge of the mud pit, covered in muck, their ATVs barely visible in the mire. He started yelling at me, asking what the hell I'd done, saying I'd deliberately set a trap for his kids. I very calmly explained that this was a legally permitted agricultural water retention area on my property. I showed him the permits on my phone. I pointed out the survey markers showing the property line. I mentioned that his boys had been trespassing on my property for years despite repeated requests to stop. He threatened to sue me. He said I'd destroyed his kids' ATVs, that this was clearly a deliberate trap, that no court would side with me. I told him he was welcome to pursue whatever legal action he felt was appropriate, but that in the meantime he needed to remove his property, meaning the ATVs, from my land. I also mentioned that I had years of documentation of trespassing, including video evidence, and that if he wanted to involve lawyers, I was prepared to counter-sue for all the crop damage. That shut him up for a moment. Getting those ATVs out was an ordeal. The father tried using his truck first, but there was no way to get a good angle, and he wasn't about to drive his truck into the mud. He ended up having to call a towing company that specialized in heavy equipment recovery. The recovery company showed up with a tracked vehicle and a winch system. It took them most of the afternoon, and I heard the bill was close to $2,200 for the extraction. All 3 ATVs were completely ruined. Mud had gotten into the engines, the electronics were shot, and the frames were bent from the extraction process. After that day, I never saw another ATV track on my property. About 2 weeks after the ATV extraction, I got a visit from the county conservation officer. The neighbor had filed a complaint claiming I'd created an illegal hazard. I was sweating bullets, thinking maybe I'd messed something up with the permits. The officer came out and spent about an hour looking everything over, checking my paperwork, walking the perimeter. He asked a bunch of questions about drainage and whether I'd altered any natural waterways. Finally, he told me everything checked out, that the permits were all in order and the construction met standards. Before he left, he asked in a casual way if I'd had any issues with people on the property. I got the sense he'd already heard the neighbor's side of things and was giving me a chance to tell mine. I mentioned the years of ATV damage. He wrote it down but didn't comment much, just said to make sure I had proper signage up marking it as private property. I made sure to add more private property, no trespassing signs around the perimeter after that visit just to be thorough. The insurance company that covered the neighbor's ATVs sent me a letter about 6 months after everything happened, claiming I'd deliberately created a hazard and they were considering subrogation to recover what they'd paid out. That got my attention. I contacted a lawyer friend I'd consulted with initially, and he helped me put together a response packet with all the permits, the property survey, and documentation of the trespassing issues. He also pointed out that their insured had been repeatedly trespassing on my property to engage in the activity that led to the loss. We got one more letter from them asking for additional information, which we provided. After that, it went quiet. My lawyer said they'd probably realized they had no case and that pursuing it would just cost them more in legal fees than they'd recover. The whole thing still made me nervous until enough time had passed that I figured they'd dropped it. The neighbor apparently tried to make an issue of it at a township board meeting a few months after the incident. I wasn't at that meeting myself, but I heard about it later from another farmer who was there. Apparently, the neighbor made his complaint about dangerous conditions on my property. From what I heard, it didn't go well for him. A couple board members pointed out that retention areas and farm ponds are common and legal. Someone apparently asked why his kids were on my property in the first place if it was so dangerous. The board didn't take any action on his complaint. I never got any official notice about it, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously they took his concerns. The retention area is still there 5 years later. It's actually become a nice feature of the property. Cattails and other wetland plants have established themselves around the edges. I've seen herons and ducks using it. In dry summers, it provides water for wildlife. It does exactly what it was permitted to do, manages water runoff and provides environmental benefits. My relationship with the neighbor never recovered, but I wasn't looking for friendship at that point. We don't speak. If we see each other in town, we don't acknowledge each other. That's fine with me. His boys are all adults now or close to it. I did run into the youngest one at the hardware store once, maybe a year later. He looked like he wanted to disappear when he saw me. He mumbled something that might have been an apology, I'm not entirely sure. I just nodded and went about my business. No point rubbing it in, he looked embarrassed enough already. The experience taught me a few things. First, documentation is everything. If I hadn't kept records of all the damage, taken photos, and collected video evidence, I wouldn't have had the leverage I needed. Second, sometimes you have to think creatively about solutions. I couldn't afford a fence, and the legal system wasn't giving me the help I needed, so I had to find another way. Most importantly, I learned that there's a difference between being vindictive and protecting what's yours. I didn't create that retention area just to be spiteful, though I'll admit the timing and location were carefully considered. But it serves a legitimate purpose, it's legally sound, and it solved my problem. The fact that it happened to make the boys' favorite trespassing route unusable was simply a natural consequence of them repeatedly riding through private property. I've had other farmers in the area ask me about the situation over the years. Most of them have their own stories about ATV trespassers or hunters who ignore posted signs. There's a sense in rural areas that property rights aren't always taken as seriously as they should be, that someone with crops growing is somehow being unreasonable when they don't want vehicles tearing through their fields. But property rights matter. The work we put into the land matters. When someone repeatedly damages your livelihood and shows no respect for your repeated requests to stop, you have to find a way to protect yourself. I don't regret what I did. The retention area was legal, properly permitted, and serves a genuine agricultural purpose. If the neighbor's boys had respected my property boundaries, or if their father had taken responsibility when I first approached him years earlier, none of it would have been necessary. These days my fields are peaceful. I still hear ATVs occasionally from the neighbor's property, but they stay on their side of the line now. The crops grow undisturbed, and I don't have to worry about finding fresh damage every time I go out to check on things. The retention area sits there quietly, doing its job, holding water when it rains and providing habitat for wildlife. It's become such a normal part of the landscape that sometimes I almost forget the circumstances that led to its creation. Almost, but not quite. Every time I drive past it, I remember those years of frustration, of being told I was overreacting, of watching my crops get destroyed with no recourse. And I remember the look on that father's face when he realized his boys had gotten stuck on my property, in a feature that was completely legal, and that he couldn't do a damn thing about. Sometimes the best solutions are the ones that work within the system. You don't have to break rules or do anything illegal. You just have to understand what your rights are and be creative about exercising them. That retention area might be the most expensive problem-solving project I've ever undertaken, but it was worth every penny. My crops are protected, my property is respected, and I can farm in peace. That's all I ever wanted in the first place. The next one is a pro-revenge story. Prelude. When I was 18, I got my first real job in the Canadian oil patch. This was in the early 2000s, and the job paid $20 an hour despite requiring no experience or formal education. At the time, minimum wage was less than $6 an hour. The job was called well testing. Basically, we connected a closed pressure tank and flare stack to newly drilled oil and gas wells, flowed the wells, and collected data for the oil companies. Setting everything up and tearing it down was hard physical labor, but the rest of the job mostly involved recording gauge readings and entering information into a computer. It was not bad for a first job, except for Gary. We worked either two-person 12-hour shifts or four-person crews covering a site around the clock. Each shift consisted of one laborer and one supervisor. I was paired with a mean-spirited alcoholic in his mid-50s named Gary. He was overweight and lazy. He only helped when something was too heavy for me to lift alone, such as the 250-pound pipes. Most of the time, he sat inside the trailer watching digital video discs, sleeping, and entering a small amount of data into the computer once every hour. He also enjoyed picking on me. He called them jokes, but they were really just insults. I am not a small man. I am around 6 feet 1 inch tall without shoes. Gary was noticeably shorter, so I was never physically intimidated by him. But at 18, I lacked confidence and still had a baby face. He called me stupid constantly. When he discovered that I had never used a power drill, he asked, "Didn't your dad teach you anything?" I made the mistake of telling him that my father had only been present for a handful of years during my childhood. The next time I made a mistake, Gary joked that it was no wonder my dad had walked out on me. I confronted him about that one. Like every other bully who gets challenged, he responded by saying I could not take a joke. We usually worked far outside town in rural areas, so I often had to eat dinner with Gary at small-town restaurants. We generally chose bars whenever possible. He drank heavily. Strangely, he could be somewhat personable when he was not at work and already had at least 2 drinks inside him. But he never stopped at 2. He drank every night. Before long, I was driving us to work in his truck. Gary was paid around $1 per kilometer for using his vehicle. Depending on the job, we could travel anywhere from 100 to 350 kilometers every day for weeks at a time. For reference, 100 miles is approximately 160 kilometers. I received only minimum wage for the travel time. Gary was hungover most mornings and did not want to drive. His explanation was that he was the boss. So he would sleep like a gin-bloated corpse while I drove his truck and he collected the mileage money. I worked with him for 3 months. That meant 3 months of insults, demeaning treatment, and verbal abuse. I do not react much when people mistreat me. That is still true today. I had already experienced plenty of bullying, which is a much longer story, so my usual response was to become quiet. I also needed the job. I tend not to do anything for a very long time, until suddenly I do. Part 1. The Power of Love. The first step in my quest for vengeance was remembering that defeating evil with the power of love was clearly not going to work. Part 2. The Power of Terror. One evening, while we were away from home on a job, I mentioned something to Gary during dinner. I told him it was pretty unfair that he slept through most of our commute while I drove his truck and he collected the mileage payments. I suggested that perhaps he could give me a few dollars for doing all the driving. Gary did not appreciate the suggestion that he should be generous. Whatever final hinge had been holding him together apparently broke because he completely lost his mind. He launched into another round of verbal abuse. I was young, and this time he managed to reduce me to angry tears. Then he threatened my job. That felt terrible. At that point, I decided that even if I could not get revenge, I at least needed to get away from him. I had already been taking notes about his behavior because I wanted to request a transfer to another crew. My breaking point had finally arrived. Unfortunately, when I reached that point, my instinct for self-preservation tends to weaken, and impulsive ideas encounter fewer safety barriers. I mostly wanted to go home, but the next morning, fate delivered an opportunity. Gary was once again unconscious in the passenger seat while I drove us to the work site. About 30 kilometers from the site, I saw a semi-truck parked in a highway pullout. The engine was running and the driver was standing outside. I quickly formed a plan. Gary normally had to be shaken deliberately before he would wake up, so he did not notice when I stopped the truck, got out, and approached the driver. I asked the trucker for a favor. He agreed. The driver climbed back into his semi and waited for my signal. Gary, still blissfully sleeping off the previous night's whiskey, did not notice when I repositioned his truck until we were almost bumper to bumper with the enormous Peterbilt facing directly toward it. I flashed the headlights. The trucker answered with his own. Then, with truly magnificent dedication, he blasted the semi's air horn. I did my part by hammering Gary's truck horn and screaming at the top of my lungs. "We're going to die!" the air horn roared. I screamed bloody murder. The truck's horn joined in. The entire glorious wall of noise lasted less than a minute. Gary launched upward and slammed into the ceiling. Luckily, his skull appeared to have the approximate density of concrete. He woke up believing we were seconds away from a head-on collision with a semi-truck. His terrified screaming quickly transformed into incoherent rage as he began realizing what I had done. I reversed the truck and drove away before he decided to climb out and make good on one of his threats. I waved goodbye to the trucker as we left. About 10 meters down the road, Gary informed me that he had dangerously high blood pressure and that I could have caused him to suffer a stroke. Around 4 years later, I attended paramedic school, so yes, in hindsight, his medical assessment was probably correct. What I did was reckless and could have ended very badly. At 18, however, I barely understood what a stroke was. At the time, I simply started laughing and told him he should probably calm down. Then I asked, "What's wrong? Can't you take a joke?" Gary continued making incomplete threats because he was too furious to form proper sentences. The angrier he became, the harder I laughed. I was howling like a hyena. He seemed caught between the urge to kill me and the knowledge that becoming even angrier might cause the medical emergency he had just warned me about. That struggle continued for the remaining 20 minutes of the drive. At one point, I even asked whether his face was normally that shade of red. When we arrived at the work site, he ordered me out of the truck, told me I was fired, and stormed away to call the company owner. I figured it was worth it. I spent the next 4 hours smoking cigarettes, occasionally laughing to myself, and savoring my extremely reckless, possibly self-destructive victory while waiting for the owner to collect me. It was a medium-sized company with around 100 employees, and the owner also acted as the general manager. During the drive back to the city, he explained that Gary had wanted to involve the police and accuse me of attempted murder. The owner had talked him out of it. Apparently, Gary had told one incredible version of events that made me sound like Satan himself, so I told the owner about Gary's behavior and explained why I had finally snapped. He laughed. He was actually a decent man, and I continued working for him until I eventually returned to school. Instead of firing me, he transferred me to another crew, where I could operate as the team's lone alleged sociopath. That was basically the end of it. I also gained a certain amount of street credibility among the other workers at the company. Looking back, the prank was dangerous, irresponsible, and could have caused a real medical emergency. But after 3 months of abuse, hearing Gary experience his own version of just a joke was deeply satisfying. The next one is a malicious compliance story. In a previous job, I encountered the absolute epitome of manglement. He was a young, smug guy who had somehow talked his way into a leadership position without ever having done the job he was supposed to manage. Unsurprisingly, he was not especially effective. In his own words, we were the skilled team who worked for him while he was in management. There are several stories I could tell about this idiot, including one where he told me I was too attractive to do my job, but that is a story for another time. This particular incident happened after our previous team leader retired and this guy took over. Our new boss was very particular about his title. He was not merely a leader, he was a production leader. He insisted that everyone refer to him by his full job title. If someone said the gaffer told us to do this, he would correct them. No, the production leader told you to do it. Apparently, we needed to show proper respect for his position. I assume this was his attempt to make himself sound important. Remember how I said he had never actually done the work before? He never understood the practical details of the tasks he assigned. Whenever one of us said something like, "That will not work. We need to complete these other steps before putting the job on the machines," you could see his eyes glaze over. His mind had already wandered back to performance indicators, metrics, and boxes he could tick. Most of the time, we simply figured things out ourselves. We completed whatever was possible and explained what could not be done. His eyes would glaze over again, and the cycle would continue. His attitude did not sit well with the team, especially because he clearly thought he was above the people doing the actual work. One small difference between him and our former boss said everything. The previous boss always said, "Our team." The new guy said, "My team." It was a minor wording change, but it spoke volumes. Eventually, we decided to maliciously comply with his demand. He wanted to be called by his official job title? Fine, we would call him by his official job title. Unfortunately for him, we abbreviated everything at that workplace. His full title was Production Leader Operations. That became PL Ops, and PL Ops quickly became Plops. I cannot take credit for inventing the nickname, but it spread incredibly quickly. Within 36 hours, every shift knew that we had to follow Plop's instructions. For anyone unfamiliar with the word, plop is an onomatopoeic way of describing something dropping, and it is often associated with defecation. Plops was not pleased with his new name. Imagine the most nasal voice possible saying, "I am a production leader," to a group of men who had been working in the trade since before Plops was born. That should give you a good idea of how much respect he received. For the rest of his short time in that role, we called him Plops. It drove him insane. A typical interaction went something like this. 3 workers were standing together in the middle of the factory discussing a job. Plops saw them and marched over, clearly planning to chastise them for not working. "Excuse me, gentlemen." One of the workers looked at him. "What's up, Plops?" "I am a production leader. Why aren't you at your machines?" "We are trying to figure out how to complete this job." "What? Aren't you trained for this?" "We are, Plops. We have been doing it for 24 years. But the problem, Plops, is that we have 4 sets of tooling available. Each machine requires 2 sets, and there are 3 of us. That means we would need..." He paused theatrically to count. 6 sets of tooling. "Nobody told me that." "Yes, because we normally split the job into individual tasks. The first person can handle the operations that do not require tooling, then the remaining tasks can be divided between the other 2 people. The order does not matter, so we split the batches 2 to 1, then swap. Do you have a better solution?" Plops hesitated. No, do that. Thanks for the advice, Plops." He walked away with his face bright red while the workers burst out laughing, still well within his hearing. Plops complained about the nickname numerous times. The head of production gave us a very half-hearted warning, but we later discovered that he disliked Plops too. Apparently, Plops constantly brought up the nickname and demanded that something be done about it. The head of production repeatedly told him that this was not a school and that if he stopped reacting, the nickname would probably disappear naturally. Plops did not take that advice. Then came the site-wide meeting. Plops arrived late. As he entered the room, several people immediately called out, "What time do you call this, Plops?" "Good grief, it must be Plops o'clock." His face turned its now familiar shade of crimson. He opened his mouth to respond, but then noticed the director of operations standing at the front of the room, having paused his presentation. Plops quickly closed his mouth and found a seat. The director continued speaking for a while before asking whether anyone had questions. Plop's hand immediately shot up. Apologies for arriving late, but I had a question regarding the half-year business projections in relation to the planned increase in production. Was that already covered, or would now be an appropriate time to ask? The question had absolutely nothing to do with the work we performed. It was painfully obvious that Plops only wanted to sound important in front of the director. The director replied, "No problem," or "Plops, perhaps save that one until the end." The room exploded with laughter. The director had no idea who Plops was and had simply assumed that was his actual name. Confused, he asked, "Oh, is that not his name?" Someone explained that it was a nickname and that his real name was John. The director apologized. Plops, desperately trying to hide his embarrassment, muttered, "Do not worry, it was not an important question." After the meeting, Plops excused himself and disappeared for the rest of the day. He returned the following morning looking even more miserable than usual. We were all still delighted that the director of operations had called him Plops, so we wisely gave him plenty of space. A few days later, after things had calmed down, Plops announced during a meeting that he had accepted a similar role at another facility and would transfer the following week. We later learned what had happened. Plops had complained yet again, this time about a director calling him by the nickname. The head of production had finally grown tired of babysitting him and quietly spoke with the director. Presumably wanting to smooth things over, the director mentioned that another production leader at a different facility was about to take maternity leave. Plops could be moved into that temporary role fairly easily. That would give management most of a year to figure out where to put him afterward. We were not sad to see him leave. However, Plops forgot to bring cakes on his final day, which was the usual tradition when someone left. One of the workers knew several people at Plops' new facility, so he made a telephone call. From what we heard, Plops' outgoing counterpart introduced him at one of their morning meetings and invited him to say a few words. He stood up and announced, "Good morning, I am John, and I will be taking over from Lisa while she is away. I am an experienced production leader, so I hope we can keep everything running smoothly during the transition. I wish Lisa all the best with the baby and with becoming a parent." A chorus of voices answered from around the room. "Well said, Plops." Eventually, we received a new production leader. He had worked in a similar role at another company and seemed like a decent person from the beginning. At his first meeting, he introduced himself and brought in a crate of homemade samosas. He explained that he did not want to interfere with our workstations unnecessarily, so he asked everyone to stop by his office sometime over the next couple of days for a brief introduction and a 5 to 10 minute conversation. The team nominated me to go first and report back on what he was like. I was able to summarize his personality before I had even sat down. I walked to his office and knocked on the door. He waved for me to enter. As I looked up, I noticed the new sign he had placed on the door. It read, "Plops Office." Anyway, thank you for watching.